This is Dr. Bafano. This is my 13th lecture on my series on Middle East politics. For this lecture, we're going to talk about the emergence of Arab nationalism and the effect it had on the Middle East. So let's get to it. I'm going to share my screen with all of you. All right, so we talked the last couple of lectures about the building of new states in the Middle East, European imperialism, and of course, indigenous state building as well in Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And one of the things we learned is that the new states that were created by Britain and France after World War I, the new Arab states that were carved out of the Ottoman Empire, they suffered from severe problems, right, in the ensuing decades. These states were often not seen as legitimate by much of the population. The states as well had numerous problems with issues such as ethnic conflict, governments that lacked legitimacy because they were set up by the Europeans in the first place, and the fact that you had ethnic groups, right, that were divided across borders, such as the Kurds. So lots of problems with these new countries created by the Europeans in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, right? So what we're going to see emerge as a result of this after World War I is an ideology that is going to contest the borders that were drawn up by Europeans after World War I. This ideology is called Arab nationalism. So in order to understand what Arab nationalism is, we first have to break down this term nationalism. And then from there, we'll discuss what Arab nationalism is specifically, how this ideology emerged, why it rose and became so prominent, and then finally, why this ideology declined by the late 1960s. So first, we have to just dig into this concept of nationalism, which I'm sure most of you at least have a kind of general understanding of what it is. So, what is a nation? A nation is a group of people that are united by some type of common identity. Okay, now this identity can be ethnic in nature, maybe a common language, it could be a common religion, or it can be something that is a common set of ideals, right? So America has a very popular civic form of nationalism. We're united by our Constitution, by our shared history of having a revolution, having this shared republic of ours. So nations could be binded together by numerous things. And more importantly, a national identity has to be political in nature. It unites millions of people within a set of borders, okay, around a common set of political ideals, right? So here in the United States, we're united by our American identity. In Germany, it's a German sense of identity. In France, a French set of identity. And you know, national identities serve a lot of purposes, right? They could create unity across millions of people. They could inspire people to support their government, to pay taxes, to serve in the military, and they give legitimacy to states. Now, national identities have not been around forever. Okay, they emerged from history, and in fact, they are very much modern in nature. Now, they might borrow from pre modern identities, such as ethnicity and religion, languages, and so on and so forth. But to create unity across millions of people and a common sense of political identity, you need to have modern institutions and modern technology. Right. So where did all of you learn to be Americans or Egyptians or Germans? Well, public school systems have something to do with this, right? Saying the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, for example, or singing your national anthem. And of course, modern media outlets, right? Newspapers, today's world, the internet, right? Television, they can also promote national identity, as can sporting events and holidays. Language standardization, right? So the creation of a common language across millions of people are also critical here. Furthermore, modern states, as they engaged in more intensive warfare, needed to be able to mass conscript from the population into the military, right? And so you need to create unity across millions of people in order to do this. So nationalism, it's a product of modernity, of modernization. It wouldn't exist without it. And nationalism specifically is the promotion of pride in one's national identity, right? If you want to get people to support the state, to support the government, you need to make them prideful in the government. And so governments make active efforts to promote nationalism. And in the Arab world, there's a specific term that is used to describe both the nation and nationalism. The word for nation in Arabic is watan, and for nationalism, it's wataniya. This term is distinguished from the Arabic term ummah, which describes the Islamic political community, right? For Islamists, the ummah is the Islamic world, and the ultimate sovereign there is God. But the term watan in Arabic is a secular term, and it refers to a secular political community, right? A people united within the borders, right, that have loyalty to their respective states. So it's a secular nationalistic term, Wathaniya. And just like within the quote unquote Western world, within the Arab world, we're going to see this term used regularly by modern states. Now, what are the positives of nationalism? Okay, so why promote it? Well, certainly it can be a source of unity, right? If you're trying to convince people to work together, to follow laws, to get them to pay their taxes, and so on and so forth, it can create unity where there's a diverse population. And if you're strategic about it, you could find some common source of identity amongst a diversity of people. So, for example, in Iraq, a case study we talked about last class, you learned how there was a diversity of different identities, Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, as well as Kurds. Well, if you promote a common identity around the Arabic language, well, that could unite, approximately 3/4 of that population under a common identity. So what national identities can do is they can create unity where there is diversity. So, for example, where this happened was with the unification of Germany in 1871. Germany used to be divided amongst a great diversity of different principalities and city-states. It was part of this loose confederation called the Holy Roman Empire for centuries, but it wasn't really united politically. It's not until 1871, under the leadership of a Prussian officer named Otto von Bismarck, that Germany would unite in order to fight a war against France. And Bismarck used a common German language across these different principalities to unite this region into one common state, into a single state. So nationalism can be a basis for which a diversity of different groups can come together and unite around a common identity. So it could be a source of unification. However, and this is the big however, it can also be a source of division. It can create division within a multi-ethnic, diverse community. So if you have different groups that have different conceptions of what they want their national identity to be, it can create conflict. So for example, if you have two groups that speak different languages, they might want a national identity based on their own language. Or if they have two different religions, they might have two different national identities based on those religious identities. This can lead to violence and political conflict. And while certainly states can promote national identities to create unity, social movement actors outside of the state can use nationalism to justify separatism and the creation of a new state. So to give you an example of this, from our previous lectures, we discussed the long decline and collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And one of the things you learned about was that there are many different separatist movements that led to the breaking apart of that empire in places like Greece, in places like Romania and Bulgaria, amongst the Armenians, and finally at the end amongst the Arabs, right? That Arab revolt that was backed up by the British helped lead to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. Separatist movements can lead to the collapse of empires. And so, just to show you an example of how nationalism can unite here, this is what Germany looked like on the eve of Otto von Bismarck uniting the German-speaking peoples of the world here. And so it used to be separated into these different polities, and then under Bismarck uses the German language as a kind of justification for uniting these different groups of people. Now, in contrast, the Ottoman Empire, and this was a part of the Ottoman Empire known as the Balkans here, ethnic separatism, differences in, what the nation should be, right? This led to the breaking apart of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of new states out of this. So sometimes nationalism can be very divisive and can lead to conflict and warfare within states or sometimes between them. In fact, we learned one of the causes of World War I was the rise of nationalist sentiments, right? And national pride can lead to violence against one's neighbors potentially. So, and of course, nations don't emerge out of nowhere, right? They are products of history and they're taught, we're socialized into them. So I'm sure if you're an American watching this video, you probably have the Pledge of Allegiance memorized by heart. It was taught to you by your educational institution. So it's something that's ingrained in people. All right, so now we're ready to learn about Arab nationalism and specifically the left-wing variant of it that emerged after World War I and became dominant by the middle of the 20th century throughout much of the Arab world. So what exactly is Arab nationalism? Well, the basic idea behind it, it's the promotion of political unity across the Arab world. All peoples who speak the Arabic language. So in the modern world, to be an Arab is to speak Arabic. While there are many dialects of Arabic out there, the Egyptian dialect, the Tunisian, the Moroccan, and so on and so forth, there is one modern standard Arabic in terms of the written language. And so the idea with Arab nationalism is that those who promoted it wanted to create unity across the Arabic speaking world where there were many different states, in much the same way as the Germans had done in 1871. In fact, the German experience inspired many of these Arab nationalists. And so it's an identity that cuts across borders that's based on speaking the Arabic language. Now, a couple of things that are important about this movement. As I said, within the Arab world, the nationalist movements that emerged during this time period were very secular. They were modern in nature. They were kind of focused on progress, making economic and social and cultural development throughout the Arabic world. And so this movement promoted secularism and feminism, and not only sought to promote Arabic unity, but to lead the way towards economic and cultural development. So part of this meant promoting secularism, right? And secularism means the separation of church and state, getting religion out of politics. And it also meant during this time period promoting feminism, much like Ataturk's Turkish nationalist movement promoted. So they promoted secularism and feminism here. This means that they rejected Islamism and Sharia law. Thus, Islamists are not going to agree with this movement. Groups like the Muslim Brotherhood are opposed to Arab nationalism. So they wanted to get rid of the Islamic courts and establish French-style secular courts throughout their respective countries. So heavy emphasis on promoting separation of church and state here. Now, they were also very left-wing in nature. Many of these groups were influenced by the emergence of the Soviet Union, as we're going to talk about in a second, by the emergence of labor union activism. But while they were secular, they did not outright promote atheism like the communists did in the Soviet Union. Islam was too important for many of the peoples in the region, so while they did promote secularism, that is the separation of church and state, they did not promote the outright abolition of institutions like mosques and praying 5 times a day, right? So they're not going to try to get rid of Islam here, but they are going to try to take Islam out of the government. Another important aspect of Arab nationalism, and this was one of the main drivers of this movement, was that they promoted anti-colonial revolts. They were opposed to the continued influence of Europeans, whether direct or indirect, in the region, whether that was direct colonial rule in Algeria by the French or Egypt's indirect influence on what was supposed to be an independent Egyptian state after 1923. The British were still occupying the Canal Zone and influencing Egypt's politics. So they were promoting anti-colonial revolts to get rid of the Europeans. And part of this as well meant rejecting the borders drawn up by the Europeans after World War I. They rejected the Sykes-Picot and San Remo agreements. They saw Sykes-Picot as a great betrayal to the Arab world. The Europeans had drawn up the borders, the French and British, without the permission of the Arabs in the region. They did not invite Arabs to the Versailles Conference, to the San Remo Agreement. So they wanted to get rid of these borders and create a single Arab state, or at the very least, promote more cooperation across the Arab world to try to unite against European rule. And so thus, part of the motivation of Arab nationalism here was to create unity amongst a bunch of small and relatively weak states to unite against European powers. Now, part of this ideology as well was a bit different from liberalism, an ideology we talked about in a previous lecture in the late 19th century. These activists were opposed to both democracy and capitalism. They were heavily influenced by the emerging Soviet Union. They promoted instead socialism, specifically authoritarian socialism. They promoted a single party state, much like what was emerging in the communist bloc in the Soviet Union. So a government dominated by one party where no other parties were allowed, and a command economy where the state would build new factories. They would take money out of agriculture and put it into industry. They would establish welfare programs and public educational institutions. And they would as well reject free trade with the West, with capitalist countries like Great Britain and France. And so the idea here is these Arab nationalists felt that trading with the Europeans and engaging in capitalism was preventing their own industrial sectors from developing. If you're trading with the British freely, you're going to have a lot of cheap goods from Great Britain entering your countries. So the idea is you block off trade with these countries and you set up state-run factories. And by doing this, the hope is that you can then engage in economic development, right? So the idea is these countries wanted to gain economic independence from the British and French, not just political independence. They wanted to develop their own factories and kick out British and French businessmen and colonial settlers from these countries. And so thus they were against free trade with Western countries, right? And so this means they were opposed to capitalism. Naturally, as a result, these Arab nationalists are not going to be liked by the capitalist West during the Cold War at all. So as a consequence, the Arab nationalists are going to make an alliance with the Soviet Union, and they're going to in the ensuing decades after World War I, develop closer ties with the communist bloc. It's important to note that part of what led to these developments is that Russia in 1917 had a communist revolution. They ended up dropping out of World War I, and in the aftermath of that, they created a single-party dictatorship with a command economy. And they were also anti-European colonialism. They were opposed to British and French colonialism and the expansion of capitalism throughout the world. So for a lot of anti-colonial activists in this Arab nationalist movement, the Soviet Union kind of made a natural ally here. And so while they rejected communism and in some ways kind of didn't fully adopt the ideology of the Soviet Union, they did have a lot in common with the Soviet Union. So they ended up forming this a series of alliances with the Soviet Union, buying weapons from them and gaining support in the form of foreign aid from the Soviet Union. On top of this as well, a lot of Arab nationalists are going to end up joining what's called the non-aligned movement. This was a movement of developing countries that were opposed to foreign interference in the affairs of developing countries. So they were opposed to colonialism, essentially. And finally, this movement, and I'm going to talk about this more in future lectures, was very much anti-Israel. Then they were pro-Palestinian. They were opposed to Jewish settlers from Europe and the Middle East moving to Israel and moving to Palestine and then setting up an Israeli state. So Arab nationalism heavily opposed to the creation of an Israeli state. We're going to talk more about this in future elections. So these are things that are going to unite a lot of middle-class labor activists and intellectuals and bureaucrats across the Arab world in the ensuing decades. Now, just to visualize this a little bit, here's a map of the Middle East. And these are countries that have Arabic-speaking populations that are in the majority. Notice it's most of the region. The only countries that don't have Arabic-speaking majorities are Iran. The majority there speak Farsi. And Turkey, as you learned about last lecture, of course, the vast majority speak Turkish. And then we have here in the state of Israel today, the majority speak Hebrew. But everybody else, you have Arabic speaking majorities in these countries. And so because of this, Arab nationalists felt that this was the best way to create unity across this part of the world and resist European imperialism. And one of the most important founders of this ideology was Sati al-Khusri. He was a well-educated bureaucrat within King Faisal's constitutional monarchy in Iraq that was established after World War I. And Iraq, of course, was this very diverse country. And Sati al-Khusri was the Minister of Education. He came up with this idea that you can use Arabic as this kind of means to unite this new and very weak state. Iraq was created on a map. So how do you create unity? You promote the Arabic language. And this is going to go on to inspire other more radical activists within the Arab nationalist movement. Now, what was the reason for the emergence of this movement? What were the factors that led to it? What political opportunities emerged and, what new resources and ideas emerged that made this possible? Well, part of this movement built off the Arab Renaissance, which we talked about in a previous lecture. In the late 19th century, we talked about how there was this revival of the Arabic language and Arabic literature and the sciences within the Arab world in places like Beirut and elsewhere. And during this process, the Arabic language was standardized. Modern Standard Arabic was created and new social movements emerged. And while these social movements were either initially liberals or Islamists, eventually Arab nationalists are going to take advantage of this. They're going to use this common Arab language that was created to promote this ideology across the Arab world, right? So Modern Standard Arabic allows the different Arabic-speaking peoples to communicate across borders. Now, another factor that led to this emergence was the grievances that were created by the new European mandates created after World War I. The borders that were created lacked legitimacy amongst many Arabic-speaking peoples. There was a lot of anger about this in Iraq, in Syria, as well as in places that were still colonized, like Algeria, right? So lots of anger across the Arab world. And this is going to inspire many Arab nationalists, as well as liberals and Islamists, to go out and engage in anti-colonial revolts in the 1920s and 1930s. In fact, we talked a little bit about that in a prior class, right? So you're going to see a lot of protests, strikes, union activity, and so on and so forth. And of course, a lot of it as well was created over mass anger over Jewish migration to Palestine. This is going to create a trigger, right? So they weren't just angry about the fact that Jewish individuals were going to potentially take over the holy site of Jerusalem. They were also angry over the fact that this was, for a lot of Arab nationalists, just another example of European colonization of their lands. Now, another big factor as well that's going to lead to the growth and the spread of this movement in the 1930s was the Great Depression. It started in the United States in 1929 with the crash of the U.S. stock market, but because the U.S. was at the time, the wealthiest country in the world, in fact, it still is today, it's going to trigger a mass economic depression throughout the globe. First, it's going to spread to Europe and then to Europe's colonies, such as Egypt, for example, right? So if, people in Great Britain are buying less shirts, that's going to hurt factories, and thus they're going to buy less cotton from Egypt, right? And so, if people are buying less cars, that's less oil they're buying from the Middle East, right? So you're going to have this issue where this is going to hurt the peoples of the Middle East economically. It's going to hurt the economy. A lot of people are going to get laid off. This is going to lead to a rise in unemployment. Mass anger is going to result as a cause of this. It's also going to as well hurt the legitimacy of capitalism throughout the globe. So a lot of a lot of people who are formerly liberals, who are in favor of capitalism and democracy, some of these people are going to turn away from that and are going to turn towards this new ideology, communism, right, that is starting to become popular. On top of this as well, you're going to see a further growth of these movements when World War II starts in Europe in the late 1930s and 1939. It's going to last 6 years. It's going to lead to millions of deaths. Many of the peoples of the European colonies are going to be forced to fight in this war once again. This is going to lead to a lot of mass anger and frustration with Europeans. And on top of that, the British and French, as a consequence of World War II, they are going to decline severely. France got occupied by Germany during the war. Britain got bombed. And the United States and the Soviet Union are going to emerge as the world's two new superpowers after this war. So because of the weakening of European colonialism, it's going to create the opportunity for protest movements to grow throughout the Middle East. And, of course, the other big opportunity is the emergence of the Soviet Union in 1917. And once the Soviet Union emerges, and they're eventually going to become one of the world's two superpowers by the end of World War II, they're going to start giving aid to anti-colonial revolts against Western powers. They're going to start to give money to a lot of these Arab nationalist movements in places like Algeria, for example. And so they're going to promote anti-European imperialism, and they're going to encourage a lot of Arab peoples to revolt. So this is also part of the reason why socialism became so popular within Arab nationalism during this time period. Here is a map of the Cold War, just to kind of help you visualize this. The two big superpowers that are going to emerge by 1945 are the Soviet Union and the United States. These countries in gray are the developing countries, the quote unquote non-aligned countries. And the Soviet Union and the United States are going to try to influence these states. They're going to try to influence their affairs and affect their economies and their political systems. And so as a result, this is going to allow Arab social movements to emerge. Now, some of these movements that are going to emerge, particularly in the 1930s, consisted of labor union activists. That is, organizations that represent the rights of workers. Because of the Great Depression, as well as the low wages that were paid by European business owners, this is going to lead to a lot of mass anger. And you're going to start to see the formation of labor activism, and a lot of mass strikes are going to be conducted against European business owners during this era. And a lot of these labor union activists are also going to engage in protests. And so these unions were operating in places like mining, public sector jobs, such as with teachers and other bureaucrats, and the manufacturing sector, although the manufacturing sector was not that large in most of the Middle East during this time period. Many of these trade union activists learned from the experience of Europeans. In fact, a lot of the settlers that came to live in the Middle East, they brought with them their own labor unions, and the Arabs are going to learn from this. They're going to form their own trade unions. They're going to learn how to strike, how to protest. And so what we're going to see is this mass movement in places like Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, where they're going to start to protest against European rule. And they're going to use the strike as one of the mechanisms to resist European influence, particularly economic domination. And so it is from these movements where we're going to see this left-wing Arab nationalist movement emerge. And eventually it's going to affect the politics of the European mandates and the European colonies throughout the Arab world. And so eventually we're going to see the formation of Arab nationalist political parties. Some of these parties were known as Istiqlal parties, independence parties that were promoting independence against European rule. And a bunch of them were promoting Arab nationalism. One of the most famous ones, and one you might have heard of before if you're familiar with Syria and Iraq politics, is the Ba'ath Party. It was formed in 1947 in Syria, and eventually a branch was formed in Iraq in 1950. And the term Ba'ath itself means resurrection in Arabic. That is, to resurrect the Arab world. These parties were Arab nationalist, formed by well-educated scholars such as Michael Aflaq. He was a Syrian Christian. And the first one was formed in 1947, initially underground, and it promoted Arab nationalism and the unity of the Arab world. And they're going to go from country to country, forming Ba'ath parties in places like Iraq and elsewhere. So Iraq's branch was founded in Baghdad in 1950, for example. And this is going to lead to all sorts of social movement activity, protests. These parties are going to try to participate in elections within the region. And it's also going to lead to a lot of instability, revolutions, and military coups. A lot of the colonies, as well as the mandates that were set up by the British and French, are eventually going to collapse because of this. So, for example, in 1952, Egypt's constitutional monarchy that was being backed by the British was overthrown in a military coup in 1952 by Gamal Abdel Nasser and a group of individuals known as the Free Officers, who were angry about continued European colonial influence in the country, the poor performance of Arab militaries and their struggle against Israel. And of course, they were very much inspired by Arab nationalist rhetoric. So Gamal Abdel Nasser, a very famous Arab nationalist, comes into power in 1952. And these Arab nationalists, when they began to take over governments throughout the region, their leaders and their supporters within society began to use mass media. And part of what made this era different from the late 19th century, that is the late 1800s, was that they used things like radio, movies, and music to promote Arab nationalism. With the invention of the radio in the early 20th century, and eventually it came into the Middle East, Arab nationalists such as Gamal Abdel Nasser were able to use the radio to promote their rhetoric across borders, across the Arab world. It became this means of mass communication. And unlike newspapers, what was great about the radio is that even people who are not fully literate could understand it. So even members of the peasantry could understand the rhetoric of Gamal Abdel Nasser. In fact, during this era, the Egyptian dialect is going to become very widespread and well known throughout much of the Middle East. People are going to be able to understand the Egyptian dialect because of this very well. So, and it wasn't just through the radio, it's going to be through the production of movies. Egypt is going to become a big center of movie production during both the interwar period and the aftermath of World War II and during the Arab nationalist era. New musicians such as Kulthum are going to emerge promoting Arab nationalist rhetoric. So this is going to be the glory days of Arab nationalism. We're going to see this ideology promoted across borders. And it's not only in Egypt. We're going to see, for example, Ba'athist coups take place in Syria in 1963, in Iraq in 1968. And in fact, what's going to happen in these countries, eventually the Assad regime and the Saddam Hussein regimes are going to emerge in these countries. So if you're familiar with those individuals and those dictatorships, that's where these dictators come from. And they're going to create single-party regimes promoting Arab nationalism and socialism. So what happens is one by one, these European-backed monarchs that were the products of Sykes-Picot and these European mandates, they're going to get overthrown one at a time. In fact, amongst the mandates we discussed a couple of classes ago, the only government that survived was that of Jordan. So their monarchy continues to exist today. The rest of those governments no longer exists. And so what's going to happen is the national liberation, what's going to happen is that these movements are going to support national liberation movements throughout other parts of the region. So as they begin to take control of different governments in the Middle East, they're going to start to give funding to other anti-colonial movements in different parts of North Africa and the Middle East. For example, the most important example perhaps is the revolution that took place in Algeria. In 1941, under French rule, Arab nationalist activists are going to form the National Liberation Front. Now, if you remember from a previous lecture, Algeria was ruled directly by the French. Over 1 million French settlers moved to Algeria took control of a lot of farmland, displaced many of the Arab peoples from their lands, and ruled directly. Algeria was directly ruled by France. It was a part of France, but only French settlers can vote in elections. And thus there was severe marginalization. It was kind of like a state of apartheid, like what had existed in South Africa. So in 1941, during a time when the French were really busy, right, with what was happening with World War II, Arab nationalists are going to form this movement, the National Liberation Front. And eventually they're going to start off as first a peaceful movement, right? They're going to engage in protests, lobbying of the French government, but the French resisted. And unlike a lot of the other colonies, the French were much more resistant to give up Algeria because it was ruled directly, and there was a lot of French settlers there that were lobbying the French government to not let this colony go. They were making a lot of money off this colony. They didn't want to give the Arabs their independence because they feared losing their lands. In fact, that is what's going to happen. And so thus, they clung on to this colony desperately. And what's going to happen is that the National Liberation Front is going to give up on peaceful tactics, and they're going to start to use violence. And what helped them rebel was support from the Soviet Union and Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt. And eventually, because of this mass support from the Arab world and the Soviet bloc, they're going to be able to wage a long struggle that's going to last from 1954 to 1962. It is going to last 8 years. It's going to kill over 1 million human beings. Aliste Horn, very famous book called The Savage War of Peace, she wrote about this conflict and the brutality of it. It was a campaign that involved ethnic cleansing. Some have accused the French of committing genocide. The National Liberation Front committed their own human rights abuses, not only against the French settlers, but their collaborators. There was even violence in France between Frenchmen who wanted to give this colony up. A lot of far left-wingers wanted to end colonialism, and the far right, especially the fascist right, that didn't want to let go of this colony at all. And you also as well had a lot of human rights abuses committed against Algerian migrants who came to France for jobs or to escape the war. So this is a bloody conflict. In fact, it actually led to the collapse of the Fourth Republic in France and the rise of the Fifth Republic led by Charles de Gaulle in the late 1950s. So this was a bloody conflict. And eventually the Arabs, the National Liberation Front are going to win this war. And the French settlers are going to be forced to flee Algeria in the process. So this exemplifies how these social movements are going to lead to the end of European colonialism in the region. Now, these are the founders of the Ba'ath Party here. And so just to show you some of these social movement activists, on the left, we have Michael Aflaq. He was a Syrian Christian. And to the right, we have Salah al-Din al-Bitar. He was a Sunni Muslim Syrian. Both of these individuals together formed the Ba'ath Party. And the reason why I'm showing these two individuals, notice one is a Christian, the other is a Sunni Muslim. This exemplifies the secular, more progressive nature of the Ba'ath Party. They united a disparate group of individuals within Syria who were Muslims, Christians, as well as various forms of Muslims, Sunni and Shia, together under one umbrella. Arabic speakers within the country. Now, of course, the Kurdish speakers, who are a minority in Syria, they're not going to support this movement, really. But the Arabic speakers in Syria are. And it's going to become a basis of trying to promote nationalist unity, not only within Syria, but also to promote the unity of the Arab world more generally. And notice as well the suits and ties they're wearing, right? They were really influenced by modernization, right? They saw themselves as these kind of progressives. But it's important to note that they were not liberal. They were not in favor of democracy. They were in favor more of a one-party state. Now, Michael Aflaq, he kind of represented the intellectual heart of Baathism and Arab nationalism. He really spoke and articulated the ideology of the movement in an academic way. But it was Gamal Abdel Nasser that was the voice of Arab nationalism, the popular voice. He was this charismatic uh, uh, officer within the Egyptian military. He grew up in the Egyptian peasantry. He rose through the ranks of the Egyptian military to become an officer, a lieutenant. And he was one of the leaders of the coup of 1952 that helped overthrow the monarchy. And eventually he's going to centralize control of the government in the next 2 years. So he was incredibly charismatic and popular. He gave these booming speeches to massive crowds that were broadcasted over the radio. He was very popular throughout the Arab world as a consequence of this. And it wasn't just Gamal Abdel Nasser. There was lots of other personalities. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya after 1969, Saddam Hussein, and so on and so forth. You're going to have a lot of these Arab nationalists use the radio to promote this rhetoric. It's also going to be as well artists, intellectuals, musicians. And not all of these individuals were males. One of the things about this era, because of the rise of feminism, is we're going to see a lot of Arab women emerge as activists. One of the most symbolically important ones was Kulthum. She was a really well-known singer. She kind of mixed a lot of styles from opera with a lot of Arabic styles of music, traditional styles, into this very classy new genre of music. She is going to be well known for giving these opera performances that often lasted several hours. Very beautiful voice. She actually grew up in an Egyptian village herself. She learned how to memorize the Quran and recite it very well. And her teacher realized she had a lot of talent. So eventually they moved her to Cairo, where she got a lot of singing lessons. And eventually she became what is probably the first diva of the Arab world, the first well-known pop singer. And she became very popular. So, and to this day, if you go into an Egyptian taxi, you will often hear her still on the radio. And because of the radio, she became well known across the Arab world, and she became a symbol of Arab nationalism because many of the themes in her songs dealt with the cause of Arab nationalism. So I highly recommend watching this video. You can see how popular she is in the Arab world here. And of course, Nasser himself, he was a very well-known diplomat. He went across the Arab world as well as the developing world, promoting this cause against colonization, not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere. You can see here him with these non-aligned actors, these different leaders from different parts of the developing world. In this picture, we see leaders from places like Ghana, Indonesia, from India and Yugoslavia, and Nasser is centered in the middle here. So Kwame Nkrumah is to his left, another very popular anti-colonial activist. He was from Ghana. So these activists, right, were promoting the end of European colonization and trying to form this movement against capitalism. Now, what was the successes and failures of this movement? And notice here I've failed in commas here, failed international activity, because they're going to have some successes, but they're going to have some failures here. So one of the things that came out of this was the creation of the Arab League. In 1945, this is right after World War II, Arab political leaders created this new international institution that had representation from Arab states across the Arab world, with the idea of creating diplomacy as well as having talks about future unification, right? So there's this idea that maybe in the future these states can unite together, but at the very least they could talk through their problems. And so it was modeled off the United Nations here, as well as the League of Nations that preceded it. And so the idea is we're going to promote unity across the Arab world here over the long term. Now, it still exists. Its headquarters is in Cairo. Arab states regularly send diplomats to negotiate problems and issues, talking about things like the Israeli-Arab conflict, talking about, for example, problems that were created by the Arab Spring and the civil wars that emerged after it. So it's still active, still exists, but it failed to create a unified Arab state. In fact, the borders of Sykes-Picot, as you're about to find out, are going to remain. The borders of San Remo are going to remain. They are not going to change due to Arab nationalist activity. But there were some successes here, right? There were successful anti-colonial revolts and protest movements. British and French imperialism, by the end of this era, is going to come to an end. Eventually, their militaries are going, for the most part, to leave this region of the world. And so, for example, the French are going to lose control of their colonies. And these were the last French colonies to be let go in the region. Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria gained their independence in 1956 and 1962. In Tunisia and Morocco, the protests were a bit more peaceful. There weren't as many French settlers in these places. And at the time, the French were more interested in clinging on Algeria because of vast number of settlers that were there. So they let Tunisia and Morocco go without much of a fight. But in Algeria, they really tried to cling on. But eventually, even Algeria is going to gain independence. And the same thing's going to happen with all other British colonies and mandates and any other form of indirect influence. Eventually, the British are going to leave. For example, in 1956, they're going to leave the Suez Canal zone. Now, despite the success of the independence movements, they're not going to unify these countries. There were failed attempts at unions. Now, there were a couple of brief unifications that did not last long. One of the most well-known ones was the United Arab Republic. It was created by Egypt and Syria from 1958 and 1961. Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Arab Nationalists in Syria, they come together to try to create a single country. But they couldn't get it off the ground. They couldn't agree on who would rule it. The differences were not over ideology, but personality. You know, you had these dictatorships that just couldn't agree on who should rule it. Gamal Abdel Nasser felt he should be in charge, as did Syrian politicians such as Michael Aflaq. Gamal Abdel Nasser, being this military officer, he was more of a jock, someone who, didn't like academic discussions and policy talk. He kind of looked down on Michael Aflaq, who he saw as kind of a nerd. In fact, he used to mock him to his face, kind of like a bully. And Michael Aflaq felt that Gamal Abdel Nasser was kind of a peasant. He was a populist. He felt that he was not very intellectual. It just led to, there was a lot of these disagreements and conflict about who should rule. It did not last long. It lasted for 3 years before falling apart. And on top of that, coordinating, between two places that were not joined together geographically became a logistical nightmare. So it didn't last long, this new country. And so by 1961, Syria is going to have another coup. It's going to fall apart very quickly. And there was also another failed attempt by Egypt. After this failed, they tried to unify with this country called Northern Yemen from 1961 and 1967. This was also another massive failure. In fact, Egypt's going to become embroiled in a civil war in this country for about 6 years. It's going to be known as Egypt's Vietnam. It is not going to go well for the Egyptians. And in fact, by 1967, they're going to be forced to leave Yemen because the civil war became too costly. On top of that, as well, as you're going to learn in a future lecture, this movement did not have success at ending Jewish colonization in Palestine, nor did it succeed at destroying the Israeli state, which was created in 1948. In fact, by 1967, Israel is going to occupy all Palestinian territory. And the failures of the Arab states to stop this and their failures in their wars with Israel is going to lead to a massive decline in Arab nationalism after 1967. So the failures to unite, the failures to stop the Israeli state, as well as the economic problems that these new Arab states are going to experience, it's going to lead to the decline of Arab nationalism. Now, another big problem here as well for these Arab nationalists is that not all Arab states are going to support Arab nationalism, not all Arab-speaking states. The conservative monarchies of the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia, which was aligned with the United States, they're going to be opponents of Abdel Nasser. If you remember from our discussion last class of Saudi Arabia, they were opposed to secularism, opposed to socialism. They were opposed, the Saudi monarchy, to secular rule, and they had this strategic alliance with the West and the United States. And so thus, The Arab Gulf monarchies, which are going to grow wealthier throughout the 1960s and 70s due to oil resources, they're going to oppose the Arab nationalist states. And on top of that, the United States is going to give these Arab Gulfs a lot of military aid and funding, and the United States is also going to support the Israeli state. You're going to find out why this is the case in another lecture. So during the Cold War, America tried to push back against any socialist and communist throughout the world, including these Arab nationalist movements. So just a couple of other quick thoughts here. The Arab League is going to form in 1945. These are the current members of the Arab League. And as you can see, just about all Arab-speaking majority states are now members of this organization. And this is where the headquarters are located. This is in Cairo. And notice it is modeled off of how the UN is structured. And, and this is just, by the way, just to visualize the United Arab Republic, Egypt and Syria. They formed this union with each other for 3 years, from 1958 to 1961. And then Egypt formed a union with Northern Yemen for 6 years. But both of these were short-lived and did not last long. And eventually what's going to happen is Arab nationalism is going to go on the decline. All right, so that does it for this lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the beginnings of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how this also became a celebrated cause of the Arab nationalist movement. So until next time, I will see you all later.